Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In this video, I'm going to talk about the difference between gauge pressure and absolute pressure. In terms of pressure, when the pointer of our gauge is on 0, that means our gauge pressure is equals 0 and our absolute pressure is equal 14.7 psi or 101.3 kilopascal. Of course, psi stands for pound per square inch and ABS stands for absolute. Okay. Basically, the absolute pressure is the standard atmospheric pressure of the Earth, which is 14.7 psi or 101.3 kilopascal. Now let's go to the conversion part. How we can convert gauge pressure to absolute pressure or absolute pressure to gauge pressure. First of all, let's clean our page a little bit. Let's do some examples. Let's convert 35 psi gauge to absolute pressure. It's always easy to draw a line. For example, the right side is gauge pressure and the left side is absolute pressure. When our absolute is, for example, it starts from 0 here. When our absolute is 14.7 psi, that means our gauge pressure will be 0. Don't forget to write 14.7 psi ABS so that doesn't confuse you. Okay. In our example, we have 35 psi gauge. So what is the absolute pressure here? We need to find this. By the way, our drawing is not in scale. Okay. For example, when it is gauge pressure, we measure from here to here. But when it is absolute pressure, we measure from here to here. So our absolute pressure will be equals this 35 psi plus this 14.7 psi. 35 psi plus 14.7 psi. So our absolute pressure will equal 49.7 psi ABS. Okay, let's do another example, but this time I will convert absolute pressure to gauge pressure. First, let's clean up a little bit. This time, convert 50 psi absolute to gauge pressure. Oh. Suppose our 50 absolute pressure will be here. So, in order to convert it to gauge pressure, we just take the 50 psi minus the atmospheric pressure, which is 14.7 psi. Our gauge pressure equals 50 psi minus 14.7 psi. That will equal 35.3 psi gauge. Okay. So in conclusion, whenever we want to convert the absolute to gauge pressure, we minus the 14.7 psi. But whenever we convert gauge pressure to absolute pressure, we add that 14.7 psi. And that's all. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe our channel.